Great. And so thank you all for being here today at the California Water Data Consortium's Data for Lunch, entitled Sluicing and Slicing, How CalMatters Pooled Water Data from Across the State to Visualize the Wet and Dry Seasons. As I mentioned, we will be recording today's presentation, and the recording of the presentation as well as the presentation itself will be available on our website later. Please subscribe to our listserv to receive a notification of when those materials are available. And then for those of you who may not be familiar with the consortium, just a little bit of background. The California Water Data Consortium is an independent nonprofit organization created by a partnership of state agencies and others to ensure that we have the best possible water and ecological information in the state. We believe this helps to ensure that everyone living and working in California can prosper in the face of unprecedented climate challenges. So as part of our work, we host our Data for Lunch series with the goal of providing a venue to learn about new and innovative water-related data methods and technologies, share important information on water data topics, and really learn from and connect with one another. And so with that in mind, I'm excited to welcome John Osborne D'Agostino and Jeremiah Kimmelman from CalMatters for our Data for Lunch today. CalMatters is a nonpartisan news organization bringing Californians stories that probe, explain, and explore solutions to quality of life issues in California, of which we're all well aware that water is a really critical one. So CalMatters created the water and drought tracker that we're going to learn about here today to distill and communicate the complexity of water and make that information available to their readers. The dashboard funnels many data points collected by public agencies, telling different pieces of the story in a really straightforward explanation of how the state is doing when it comes to water management and access. Today, John and Jeremiah are going to walk people through the dashboard itself, but given the consortium's audience, we're also going to hear about some of the complexities and opportunities in both data availability and usability, and ideally really facilitate a conversation about both the state of water data in California and opportunities to continue improving the CalMatters dashboard, as well as the data accessibility that helped to power that dashboard and is really the consortium's mission and where these two organizations intersect nicely. And so by way of introduction, Jeremiah Kimmelman is a data journalist who uses code and data to make information and policy easier to understand. Before joining CalMatters, he was a graphic editor at the COVID Tracking Project and a data journalist at NBC News covering elections and national politics. John is the Data and Interactives editor at CalMatters. He's an award-winning data journalist, web developer, and game designer. And before landing at CalMatters, he worked with the Henshinger Report, EdSource, East Bay Express, and a number of other media organizations. And so before I hand it over to Jeremiah and John, just a quick run through of what our time together looks like today. We're in the welcome and introduction, and we'll have about a half-hour presentation from Jeremiah and John. We'll then have time for questions, and I encourage you all to drop your questions into the Zoom chat. I'll be collecting those for the Q&A portion either during the presentation or at the end. And we really are hoping to have more of a discussion. So where relevant, we will provide the opportunity for people to ask questions during the presentation. And then similar to our previous meetings, the presenters have graciously agreed to stay on Zoom for an informal discussion after our 1 p.m. close for those of you who may have additional questions or want to stay on for some additional discussion. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to John and Jeremiah. And thank you so much for being here today.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks for having us. Hey, so you already got our attention. There are, as we tried to put as many water puns as possible into this dashboard and our talk in general, but I encourage you to not only drop questions, but any missed opportunities you saw for water puns in our presentation. So let's go over what we'll be talking about for the next 30 minutes. Next slide, please, John. We already got a little introduction, but we'll go over again who we are. We're going to tell you about this thing we made, this dashboard. We're journalists, so behind everything we do, we're trying to communicate. We're trying to tell stories about various complicated issues facing the world, and in particular, California. We do that, so we're going to talk to you a little bit about our goals there. We're going to talk about the data sources we used. We're going to talk about the automation tactics we use to keep this dashboard up to date. And then we're going to have a little bit of our positives and negatives and two things that could be possibly improved about California water data. And we'll close out with painting a picture of where we hope to take this dashboard into the future. So next slide, please. Briefly, and again, I'm Jeremiah. The other person you see there is John. He's my editor. We're both on the data team here at CalMatters. We pride ourselves on covering basically every beat in the newsroom with a team of 3. And so we cover state politics and policy using code, charts, and old-fashioned reporting.
Hey, everybody. So just want to give a little bit of context about how we got to this dashboard. So at CalMatters, it's really important for us to be able to explain really complicated state policy to Californians and how that policy impacts them in their day-to-day lives. And we do this in a number of ways, but one of the ways in which we do that is by building what we call explainers, which are pretty in-depth guides to different topics and policy issues or problems facing the state of California. We started doing this in 2017. The first explainer we did was about homelessness, and that's evolved over the years. And we've experimented with different ways of telling stories since then. And eventually, we decided that we wanted to incorporate more data into these explainers in a way that could be pretty like hands-off and self-updating. So we kind of were mulling over different ideas in 2021 about what kinds of dashboards we wanted to do, but we didn't want to just put data on a page and leave it up to the reader to decide like why it makes sense to them. So we were experimenting with, okay, well, how can we incorporate what's good about our explainers, which is really concise details about how policy impacts the reader, but also incorporating that data. So we decided to experiment with these data dashboards, and at the time we were kind of mulling over different ideas for like what kind of dashboards we want to do. Water was definitely at the top of the list for reasons I'll get into more later. We also were interested in wildfires, air pollution, public health. We kind of internally joked that like we were making the Captain Planet dashboards, but ultimately we decided that we were going to focus first on water. And that's mostly because at the time, we were in the second year of another drought after just wrapping up a long mega drought several years prior. And at the time, it didn't seem like things were going to change for the better anytime soon. So, we really wanted to, find a way to incorporate like all the data out there about water, tracking all of the surface water and groundwater, and like figure out a way to like contextualize that to make sense. Like why does this matter? Like why does a drought matter, right? If you're living in a city, it might matter differently than if you're a farmer. So we decided we were going to experiment with our first dashboard covering the drought, which is as the drought has abated, has also now evolved into focusing more on maybe it's getting a little too wet at times, So, but either way, like this was the goal. We wanted to build a tool that people could visit on a regular basis using data sets that were updated as regularly as possible to help explain the story of water in California and why it mattered to them most. So the link to the dashboard is below. I'm not going to go to the dashboard and scroll through it, but feel free to as I'm talking. But here's like a little video just to kind of, give a sense of what we do. And, there's a lot of different elements that we'll get into more about the dashboard. We wanted to clearly have data front and center, visualize big numbers that are important. But we also wanted to like give enough context that a reader who was looking at the dashboard could get a good, at least a basic sense about why is it important to track drought? Why are reservoirs important? Why are household water shortage reports important? So, we basically decided that we were going to experiment with storytelling a little bit and see what happens. Oops, excuse me. There we go. Okay, so we have a lot of different sections in the dashboard. It's gotten very big over the years, and will probably continue to grow, and we'll talk more about that later. But there are some like key sections that I just wanted to highlight here. The first being kind of the top, we have like a key numbers section. I will dive into that a little bit more shortly, but the idea behind that was we wanted, if somebody just landed on this dashboard and didn't scroll any further past those key numbers, what are the most important metrics that we can convey to those readers about something important about water in California? Are we in a drought? What snowpack level? How are snowpack levels right now? Are people reporting more household water shortages than they were previous years? Reservoirs. Clearly, reservoirs are very important for California. They store water over drought years. And the data there is really good. It's reliable. We decided with that we were going to give both an overview over time, how much water has been collected over the years, just to track general trends. And also we have a tool just looking at the 12 largest state-owned reservoirs that gives you some context about, okay, here's where we are right now, here's how much water is in the reservoir, how does that compare to previous years? And that's the real key theme in a lot of the ways in which we tell the story about water, is not just saying, here's a number, but here's a number and some context. Whether that's historical context or some other context that makes that number a little bit more meaningful for our readers. Aqueducts. I mean, I don't think many people really appreciate just how insane it is that like the water infrastructure that we have in the state, and how we move water from one part of the state all the way to the other in this like web of aqueducts and pump stations connecting to all these various reservoirs throughout the state. And we really wanted to explain that visually to our readers, which we'll also get into a little bit more. We experimented with some, what I think is some interesting storytelling to kind of take people on a journey, starting from the source in the mountains and coming down to Southern California. Obviously, rain and snow, very important aspects of water in California. So we wanted to give context, historical context over the years, looking at different trends and how much precipitation the state is getting, what are the conditions right now in different parts of the state, how much snow is storing up in the mountains, which is again a vital source of water as that snow melts and comes down to the valleys. Water usage. This section is, I would say at this point, a little stale, unfortunately. We originally, when we first built this section, it was after Governor Newsom announced that he wanted a voluntary 15% cut in urban water usage. Again, as this was July 2021, water was, or the drought was still pretty strong. There was really no signs of abating. So this was like something that we decided, well, let's follow this. And at the time, the State Water Resources Control Board had a really good dashboard in place that was tracking just that progress towards that 15% goal across the state and across different hydrological regions, and also drilling down into which is a mouthful, the average monthly residential gallons per capita daily, which basically is what's the average amount of water people are using per day, and just tracking that and seeing what kind of progress we were making, which the progress was pretty good. Every year by year there was a reduction in the amount of water people were using. But unfortunately, those data sources are now stale. And the beginning of last year, after we had that incredibly wet season, the voluntary reduction order was rescinded. But what was also rescinded, much to our disappointment, was the data that existed on that dashboard. it wasn't just not updated anymore, it was completely removed. Which, for archival purposes was very disappointing. We luckily were collecting that data monthly beforehand, so we have an archive of it, but other people who might be interested in that data, it's no longer there. And then also the tracking how many gallons of water on average people were using daily, that data set also went stale. So we're going to have to rethink that section a little bit and how we can continue to track that. And I would love to hear any thoughts people have about, data sets that exist that could help kind of supplement those points, or other water use data. Also in that category is agricultural water use, which I think is the tracking of that data is very problematic in the state. We'll talk more about that as well, especially since it accounts for about 40% of the water use overall. Finally, we have a section on groundwater and wells. I mean, the general theme here was like, let's talk about surface water, but let's also drill down and talk about groundwater. So with that data set, there's a lot of good data out there, and there's some missing holes, but we generally wanted to convey a couple of points. One was how many more wells are being drilled, and how deep are those wells? What's the median drill depth of those wells? And the reason we went with that is, averages could get a little funky, but we thought, okay, well, let's go with the middle value and see, like, is there a trend in new wells having to be drilled deeper, which there is. We also wanted to track household water shortages. I mean, this is an issue that impacts people directly if you rely on well water and your well is running dry. So how often is that happening? Where is that happening? We also, there's a very nice data set that kind of tracks wells that meet certain criterias, and comparing like how dry those wells are compared to historic norms, just to get a sense of like, are wells overall drier than they used to be? And also subsidence is another issue that we tackle in that section as well, because again, most people don't realize that the ground is dropping every year, particularly in the lower Central Valley. And I mean, that's an issue that impacts everybody, especially as we get more wet years, more flood potential, things like that. So briefly, I'm going to talk about the journalism behind this, and then we're going to talk about the data. So as journalists, I mean, we have a simple goal. We explain matters so the readers can understand them. And we focus on things two things we can explain, which is the accuracy and comprehension, and data helps us do that. There was a couple of different storytelling devices that we wanted to play around with while we were building this dashboard. And one of which is, I'm going to go back to the key numbers now. So, this was meant, our data, when we're tracking user behavior on our website, many people don't get past like a third of a story. I mean, that's just user behavior mostly overall. So we wanted to put the important stuff closer to the top. And we figured if you're going to visit this site for the first time, and maybe you just do a little bit of scroll and then you leave the page, what's the most important takeaway that you can get? So we thought, let's pick some water metrics that we feel are pretty important that we can contextualize and put that at the top. So currently we have this section changes regularly depending on what's happening with water and drought. And first and foremost, we want to show, well, hey, we don't have a drought, right? Like, awesome. So you can just look at that at a glance and get that information. We also wanted to talk about water deliveries, which is something that doesn't impact most people, but well, to some degree, but you know what I mean? It's something that is kind of out there and most people don't realize it's happening, but we want to tell people, yeah, this is happening. Water is being delivered. There are contracts, and sometimes those contracts can't be fulfilled for various reasons. Snowpack and precipitation, two very important metrics to follow, and giving people kind of a general sense of what's happening there compared to averages. Also, household shortages, household shortages, and also just how many wells are ranking in their lowest percentile of depth. So the key numbers section is really meant to just kind of give you that real quick like overview, that snapshot of what's happening, and hopefully entice you to read more. I'll pass this on to Jeremiah to talk about the scrollies that we have to tell the story of groundwater and aqueducts.
Thanks. So this is a little video. This is a technique, not really a portmanteau, but it's a really overloaded word storytelling. And the idea here is to do some explanatory work and tie the pace of the storytelling to the user's scroll, putting it in their hands so they can decide how quick or how slow they want to go through it. In this case, it's going really fast on this video, but I do encourage you to pull up the website on your phone or on your computer and look at it. And basically what we did here is we took a break from the data to start explaining some stuff. Now, this has lots of data in it. John, if you can hit play one more time, you'll see that there's orange dots that appear, and that's where all the people in California live. And then there's blue that appears, and that's where all the precipitation happens in California. And so there is lots of data in this little scrolling part that we have here. But our major goal was, as John said, to help people understand just how extensive the infrastructure is to get the water to where it needs to go in this state. Very frequently, in covering California politics, we hear lots of stuff like California can't build, innovation is dead, whatever it might be it housing, high-speed rail, whatever kind of infrastructure project is du jour. But the reality is that California has tremendous amount of infrastructure, including the California Water Project and all of its associated kind of tertiary supplies. And when we were doing the research for this project, we realized that no one knew about that. Yeah, if you drive by Highway 99, you might see the canal, or if you grew up in Patterson, you might see the canal in your backyard. But beyond that, people didn't have a concept that this is how water travels hundreds and hundreds of miles from the top of the state to the south of the state. And so we have two scrollies in here. We won't go over the second one, but this was one of the devices we tried to use to interrupt all that data and put a little bit of history explanation in the reader's hands.
Yeah, and thank you. And the second scrolly is really focused on groundwater and kind of mapping that out to show people kind of, where dry wells being reported across the state, where are new wells being built, where are there just other water shortage issues happening at the groundwater level. So highly encourage you to check that out. So another storytelling device that we use is at the very top. This section is updated pretty regularly as news happens, but really, like when you land on the page right before the key numbers, this section is something that we write almost like a little mini story to highlight something really important that might have happened in the water world and let readers know. So like right now, it's about the official April 1st snowpack measurements and why that matters basically, and why it's a good thing that it's above average. So visualizations, we have a lot of maps, we have a lot of charts. There's a little bit of work that needs to be done on that front. We have a wildfire dashboard as well. And one of the things we want to incorporate with these visuals with the water dashboard in the future is to have the ability to kind of look at the underlying data that's powering the charts. But we experiment with just different, basic stuff, some bar charts, looking at trends over time, integrating when there were drought years in those charts as important context. This one, I thought this one was cool. This one is talking about new wells and the median well depth. But we wanted to reverse that because make it feel like the drilling is happening and how far down that drilling is happening visually, so people can really get a sense of that drop, right? That's getting lower and lower and lower as the years go by. We also have some maps too. Most of our maps are based on hydrological region, just because that makes sense, at least for the data. I think most people, if you ask them what hydrological region they lived in, they probably gloss over what are you talking about? I don't know. But we thought it was important to map the data that way, just because a lot of the data sets out there do connect with those particular shapes. But also, I think it just gives like a nice bigger picture of kind of things rather than county level or smaller levels. But happy to hear any suggestions as well on different shapes that we could use for maps. We also wanted to sprinkle throughout the dashboard, just kind of like call outs mostly, very similar to the call outs we have in the key numbers section. But after you review a chart and kind of read the section about it, where we kind of contextualize what's going on and why it matters, just kind of highlighting like, hey, here's something important and mostly current about this data, and usually trying to contextualize that with historic trends. But yeah, this is another storytelling advice just to give people, pieces of information to cater to readers who have different user experiences. Some people just like to scroll through quickly, and these can kind of help stop people and let them kind of digest some information. And we also do this with just the little, we didn't want to we were trying to avoid large blocks of text throughout the dashboard. It was very easy to go in that direction because it's a complicated issue, and it was also a balancing act. Like we want to provide context, but not so much context that it might turn people off, but not too little context that it marginalizes the issue. So we tried to find a balance between that, and would love to hear feedback from you folks about whether we succeeded or not.
And so in order to do all that, you can, if you've pulled up the dashboard, even just looking at the screenshots that John showed, you can tell there's a lot of data in the dashboard. If you pull up the dashboard, I don't know, there might be 30 charts overall in there. There's a ton of data that is swimming together to make that thing work. And we, going back to John's stated goal of journalism, is to explain complicated issues. And in order to do that, we have to make sure we're accurate, and we have to increase comprehension among our readers. And so in order to achieve the accuracy purpose, we went to the most authoritative sources we can find. They're also the only sources of water data. There's not really a lot of private incentive for companies to be collecting the same sort of data. But we mostly pull from various government agencies. Here in California, we have the Department of Water Resources, which we'll talk a little bit more in depth in the next slide. And we also pull from NOAA and USGS. And so what we learned in doing this is, we don't expect all the water data to be in one place. That's an unreasonable expectation given how complicated the issue is, and given the different jurisdictions. You can, USGS has different goals than DWR when it comes to collecting and managing its water data. But we were a bit surprised at how hard it can be to find particular data sets for particular issues. And I think that speaks to the value of forums like this consortium, where it pulls people together to actually say, oh, we have this data, which do you want? Because honestly, being able to talk to a human would have made this a lot easier. Next slide, please. And, we don't pick favorite agencies, right? Because we have to cover all of them. But if I'm being very candid with you, DWR is up there. I think DWR does a great job with a number of things. Water in California, as we've said a number of times and cannot be underscored enough, is complicated. There's groundwater. Within groundwater, there's things like toxins, like hexavalent chromium, and also shortages, and also subsidence, and also cost for new drills and drill depth. And then that's just groundwater. And that's also just groundwater in particular parts of the state. Other parts of the state have different challenges with groundwater, such as recharge or whatever it might be. And on top of that, you have surface water. You have reservoirs, and you have water that fell from the sky more recently, like from snow and rain. And so I really want to commend DWR for just having this compendium. Now, it was a little hard to sort through some of it and find the stuff we wanted, find the most updated stuff, find the stuff that was most authoritative. But once we did find it, it was pretty fantastic, because that data came in machine readable formats, it's stable URLs, it's got reasonable documentation, although we'll go over that in a little bit in our things we like and things we think could be improved. But here's the list of data that we currently get from DWR. We get precipitation data, we get snow water equivalent data, we get the reservoir measurements, household water supply shortages, well completion reports, and table A allocations. And I didn't know this beforehand, so if you don't know this either, no worries. But table A is basically how much do the major water users get from the California Water Project. So that's basically the output of the canal system or the aqueduct system. So some of these data updates every day. Some of it updates every other day. Some of it updates once a month. Some of it updates whenever the department decides to update it. When we were building the dashboard, didn't want to have to think about all that. We didn't want to have to set a calendar reminder that says, hey, on Mondays, we got to go update the precipitation data. And so we tried to use automation. Again, we're a team of 3 servicing a newsroom of 30 reporters covering almost every beat, every policy area in the state. And so where we can use robots, we do. And this is one of those cases. This is a screenshot from the automation tool we use, which is on GitHub. My understanding is that the last water data consortium meeting was about version control and version control tools. And so I think you talked about GitHub, but it's a site where people normally store code, and we store code there, but we also store lots of data there. And what's nice about it doing that way is we get a dashboard like this that can say, hey, it's all green. All of our data is being updated appropriately. That's great. And it was updated as of 3 hours ago. Also great. But as John said, when data gets removed, it helps us have an archive. So not only do we track the data, we track all the data that changes. And that's really useful for us to go do quality control checks, to backfill when the authoritative source is removed, or we haven't done this that much in water, but we do it quite a lot in other policy areas like criminal justice, build wholly new novel data sets based on changes over time. And so we're a big automation data team. Almost all of our data at some level passes through a system like this, and we just wanted to share with you the tools that we use to do that. I see there's some questions in the chat, but we're going to get to them right after, in 2 slides. But we were invited to, we say you didn't ask, but Tara asked us to give us our thoughts on water data. And so really high level, here's what I have for you. This data is super valuable, and people who work on it should be proud of doing that. And they should be aware that people use it, not just scientists. Journalists use it, consumers use it, activists use it. A lot of those people use it after the journalists have used it, but regardless, they use it. That being said, John and I are both programmers and journalists, and our third teammate is also a programmer and a journalist. And this data generally required a relatively high skill set in order to be able to use. You had to have technical sophistication and scientific sophistication in order to understand what you were looking at. Sometimes that is as simple as this CSV is literally too big to open in any commercial software. You have to write code that can parse it as it goes. And sometimes, well, let's go through the positives and negatives. So one thing we loved, data is updated and generally well documented. There's a couple of things that we find missing across the board in documentation that we'll get to and could be improved. But in general, data dictionaries were there. Sometimes there was a contact there. Additionally, almost all that data was machine readable. Okay, so machine readable, to be clear, does not mean PDFs. In fact, it's the opposite of PDFs. It's not that an Excel spreadsheet was turned into a PDF that is still not machine readable, although there might be like text data embedded in it. Machine readable, in our case, refers almost exclusively to flat text files such as JSON and CSV. Other files like shape files and those kinds of things, those are machine readable, and we put those in the same camp. But we really liked that at least DWR placed an emphasis on having machine readable data, and it was scrapable. Scrapable in this context means that it's available at a stable URL. So our robots cannot go to the DWR website and then parse all the text like a human can and say, okay, that's the link I need to click on the data. Actually, what we would prefer is a URL that doesn't change, but that the data at that URL does change. And so what that means is that our robot can hit that URL on the interval it needs to be, let's say every day at 6 a.m., download the data, see if anything's changed. If it has, do some computation. And if it hasn't, move on. If that URL changes, or as John mentioned before, gets removed, we're in a pickle, especially because this is really, there's only one place to get most of this data. Now, if we were offering, let me pause in the middle between the negatives and the positives and just say, one of our major goals with coming and talking to you about our project here is to open up a lot of lines of communication with the exact people who came here. We're going to have our emails on the last slide, but we would love to talk to you about any questions you have, any errors you find, any stuff you're working on. Because one of the hardest things, now I hope there are no PIOs in this group. I assume not, because it's relatively nerdy and scientific. But one of the things that is extremely hard to do when you're working on a project like this is talk to 10 different data stewards through 10 different PIOs. It just doesn't work. PIOs have very valuable jobs. I respect what they do. If I find it annoying at times because they're usually between me and what I want to understand. But with science data, a PIO has almost no place in the equation, in my opinion. And that's because questions like, hey, 32 out of the 7,000 rows, I have an empty value in this column. What does that mean? Are embedded in a host of other questions you have about the data, and the PIO is just not going to adequately be able to do that. In fact, I'm not even sure. Oh, thank you, Amanda, for the question. A PIO is a public information officer. So those are the people that media deal with and probably then come to you as the scientists or data stewards or other technical bureaucrats in the system and say, hey, a reporter wants to know this stuff. Sometimes that's good. Like, hey, are we still in a drought? Okay, that can be answered. But hey, what does it mean when this data has changed and 50 rows got removed? What does that mean? What does it mean when I'll give you a different example from a different beat or policy area. What does it mean when there's like a completion column, but there aren't values in it all the time, but all the other data related to a completed data set is there? Does that mean something else? And usually all of these kinds of things reflect some part of the bureaucratic process, right? Data is not objective. Data is not unimpeachable. Data is made by humans for humans. I mean, it looks like in the future, it might also be made by robots for robots. Right now, it's made by humans for humans. And what we mean by that is the methodology matters. And the methodology is super important for us to know because usually that methodological process or bureaucratic process is itself embedded in the data in the form of missing values or something crazier like, hey, actually, we completely changed the computer system in 2018. And that means that from 2018 to 2016 is one set of data. In 2019 through the present is another set of data. Which brings me to my next point. Caveats can feel like minefields when you're wading through some of this, this muck. And so I would ask people who are data stewards to put any caveats in that data dictionary. I don't want to have to email you for caveats. You probably don't want to have to talk to me about caveats unless we're having a nuanced conversation about it. So please just document what those are. Hey, this data is only valuable between this time range. Hey, this data represents user submitted data, so it cannot be treated as authoritatively as scientifically collected data, whatever it might be. Something else we found really challenging is that it's hard to find non-governmental data. You might ask, like, well, why? What, you're a journalist, why are you looking for private data to tell a story about, a public policy problem, water management? Well, in the case of data, one of the data sets that I think we all want, or many of us want, which is agricultural water usage data, you can imagine that the industry does have some of that data. My understanding is industry is relatively focused on profit management. And so you can imagine that they have more detailed water tracking or water application data than other governmental entities. Sometimes the government can't even request the data from the private entity because of various rights that the business has. And then finally, data should never really be removed. It can be abandoned and kind of depreciated. It can say, hey, this data is no longer updated. But when it's just removed, that creates a lot of uncertainty for us as journalists. It creates an opportunity because now we have data no one else has, but it creates a lot of uncertainty. Why was that data removed? Is it not authoritative? Can we not rely on it? So in general, we ask that data not just disappear, that it's marked, this data is no longer useful because of these reasons. I know that was a lot, but we're going to have a Q&A where hopefully we can dive into some more of these. So John, why don't you tell us what's next on the horizon?
Sure. So, like I said at the beginning, this dashboard is constantly evolving as conditions change, as new data sets are discovered or become available. So, some of the ideas we have, and I would love to hear feedback about this. We really want to, or initially we were going to have a section on kind of environmental issues such as Chinook salmon and Delta smelt populations, and kind of following those trends and what's going on there. And as we, this is the second year I think in a row now where the salmon season is canceled because of population numbers. This is an issue that has economic and environmental implications. So this is something we want to reincorporate into the dashboard. We also want to think about a section about water contamination, particularly focusing on forever chemicals, which is becoming more of an issue, and the new federal standards certainly give that a nice news peg. But really, do you live in a community where these kind of chemicals have been detected in the groundwater? Do you rely on that groundwater? How is that going to impact you? And other contaminants as well. So we're exploring that. One of the areas we really wanted to do at launch was an accountability section. We have this whole timeline about Sigma and compliance with the law. We really want to dig into accountability and compliance, and dig into what water agencies are promising and being able to track progress. This is a very important section for us, and right now we have a section at the end that just kind of shows the timeline for the law. But in the future, we really want the reader to be able to get a good sense about how water agencies are complying with that law. Is it making an impact? Which is always important. And I really would love ideas about this, because this seems like a situation where there's just so many water agencies and maybe different ways in which they're reporting based on this law. And so discovering, effective ways where we could accomplish this goal would be really useful. And finally, finding reliable ag water use data. This is something where I think it's important in a state where, again, 40% of the water about is used for agricultural purposes. It feeds the state, it feeds a nation. It's a very, very, very important data point that I feel like just kind of gets ignored sometimes. And we really need to know more about that. And especially if we get into another drought cycle, especially in the context of subsidence, especially in the context of dwindling groundwater supplies. I mean, it's all ties together. It has massive impacts on people. So these are just some of the ideas we have. But if you have any other interesting data points that you think we should explore incorporating into the dashboard, we'd love to hear it. And again, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for exploring the dashboard if you did. And we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, first of all, a huge thank you to both you, John, and Jeremiah, for the great presentation. Really wonderful to see. And we have all sorts of great questions already. So the first question is from Christine Johnson, who said, very useful effort. Thank you so much. How do you ensure the accuracy and consistency of the data you're using and integrating? So it's a multifaceted question. I'll keep going. How do you reality check what derived water information reflects, that it actually reflects actual conditions? And then what data are crucial to understanding what's missing in terms of critical data gaps?
I can take the first one. We have a couple of different layers of data integrity. The first being whether the automation fails. The automation fails, that can indicate several things. It could indicate a change in the data set, in or the way in which we gather the data. That will flag us to see if, okay, is this on our end? Is this on the source's end? And trying to correct for that, or is it like a calculation? Did a field change? Did a property in the CSV change? So that's the very first layer. After that, we try to do regular checks on the dashboard just to see, okay, so the automation saying this updated, but this looks a little off. Why don't we double check that with the source and see if maybe there's something happening on our end, or maybe the automation didn't work right, because the automation doesn't 100% work. It's always prone to error. So we try to do spot checks occasionally, as much as we can. And I try to build in like a monthly routine of kind of going through the dashboard and double checking different sections of it, trying to keep track of, did the state announce new table A allocations, making sure that we capture that, or there's a couple of data sets that we manually update. So kind of keeping a regular pattern of just seeing if there's updates and whatnot. But yeah, we try to do general spot checks when we can to make sure that the data we've collected is what the state is reporting in their source.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I can take the last part of that, which is what are the gaps in data? We said it a couple times, but I can't underscore enough how frustrating it is to have a conversation about water policy absent data on agricultural water usage. Speaking personally, maybe I shouldn't do because it's going to be recorded, but personally, I just don't understand the focus on urban water regulations and cutbacks when there is so little information on agricultural water usage, and when we know that agricultural water usage, drowns urban water usage by quite a magnitude. So, we were very excited when we found the Watergate data. Very excited. We built a whole visualization based on the Watergate data. Then we come to learn the Watergate data is not useful. It's not useful because it's potentially double counting water usage. It's invalid data. I'm actually, if anyone here has a use case for that data, I would love to hear it, because from my perspective, I don't understand why it's even collected in that way. So agricultural water usage, I think, is the biggest missing hole for us. Sigma was a big hole, but we see right now, like, look at what the was it last week, this week, the hearing on the Tule subbasin. So Sigma is coming into effect, and those regulations are happening. The GSAs have submitted plans. That data is starting to be available. However, it's locked away in PDFs. If you've ever looked at one of these groundwater management plans, there are hundreds of pages in a PDF. It's not clear what the standardized data is, how to compare one plan to another. And so those are kind of the two missing pieces from my perspective: agricultural water usage, and then a meaningful, common, shared Sigma data standard that helps us compare GSAs and groundwater plans to each other.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Awesome, thank you. And I know we have some folks who are doing some work on ag water use data on the call, and have already requested that they connect with you. So I think you'll get some outreach based on that comment.
Would love that. Yeah, Jeremiah at CalMatters.org, please.
Perfect. We dropped it into chat. So next question is, how do your design principles change as you tailor the dashboard to a mixed audience of professional water providers and the public?
Yeah, that was the balance I was talking about earlier. Trying to build something that the layperson could explore, that wasn't too complicated, that gave some concise context about why it's important to them. It's a juggle when you're trying to satisfy both the layperson and the professional. With the professional, I would hope that the dashboard is useful for them, maybe more as like a not real-time tool, but like a regularly updated tool. Something if they're doing research in a particular topic and you're just trying to get high numbers. I think something we're going to do for professionals a little bit more is we build a lot of endpoints that power this dashboard, and making that eventually available for professionals and researchers to use. So basically, like, hey, why don't we help you, instead of going to the source and having to clean the data yourself and structure it, we can provide you something that we've structured and cleaned that maybe will save you a couple of steps in the process. But design wise, I think we gravitated more towards the layperson, and really just hope that, like, as a professional, it's just a resource that, like, if you're just trying to kind of keep tabs on something that you're covering and on a regular basis, that could be something that's useful. Hope that answers your question. Jeremiah, do you have any other thoughts?
No, just to highlight that, we're a newspaper, so we focus on the lay people. That's our goal, is to increase comprehension. And we kind of felt like there was a big opportunity here to do both, because we hadn't seen a dashboard in this breadth on this subject yet. And so some of those charts I don't think are useful for lay people, but I hope they're useful for people who have a little bit more context on the policy that undergirds water in California.
And actually, like, a question I would send back is, as professionals, would it be useful, if you're in the, a particular section of the dashboard where we're displaying some data? I mean, would it be useful to have either like a download as CSV button that you can just grab a CSV of what we're charting out, or having like at least a table that you can look at the actual numbers? Like, is that something that would be of value?
Any thoughts on that? No one's speaking up. Oh, I see a yes.
All right.
Okay, I've got a few more questions here. Patrick Atwater asked, are there examples from other industries or sectors that have a better protocol for interacting with data stewards? And suggests, says perhaps more of a community forum could be helpful. What have you seen used elsewhere, particularly given that you work across sort of spectrum and sectors?
Yeah. Well, the bad news first. This is a statewide problem. We have yet to encounter a relatively large agency that is pretty open and candid with their data stewards. From our perspective, it seems like there's almost a statewide policy on funneling journalists through these media officers, these PIOs, to talk to data people. I don't know if Ben Brzing, I hope I got his name correctly, is on the call, but he manages like well completion reports, for instance, and his emails all over that data. And I emailed him a few times to ask. He was extremely helpful. But once it became clear we were going to publish something, a PIO came in, and it was a little bit more difficult to have a frank conversation. As a journalist, I'll just say, at least I'll speak personally, like, we're never trying to get bureaucrats in a gotcha position. Generally speaking, we're trying to understand why something contains both A and B when A and B seem contradictory. So, we generally don't quote bureaucrats. That's generally on background, and it's something I wish we could explain more to PIOs so that we might be able to talk more frankly. But I will also say there's a lot of agencies who do it way worse. So for instance, like if you ever work with criminal justice data, heaven help you if you try and talk to whoever made that stuff. I mean, it just doesn't even exist. So I would,
Or public health.
You would think that because we just went through a pandemic, the public health department would have this on lock, but they don't either. And so it's quite frustrating. And I don't think there's anything like the California, like this group or other policy beats. So they might be something that this group can really facilitate. I would love it if it was a community group, because that feels like the right level of formality. Hey, I'm trying to use this data. Am I using it correctly? What am I going to step in if I do this kind of analysis? Not, hey, how come your data contradicts the governor's stated policy positions? That's not what we're asking. So great question. I don't have a good example for you.
Yeah, no, this is something that we grapple with a lot. And so I think it's a great ongoing question to grapple with. And ideally, yeah, having more of a community forum around that would be great. I'm cognizant of time, and I also know that our presenters have agreed to stay on for a few more minutes. I know several of you have like multifaceted questions. And so I'm going to encourage you to stay on if at all possible to ask some of those, because we do want to get to them. But in the interim, I'm going to just say huge thank you to Jeremiah and John for being here today, sharing their work on this, and then also just your openness and continuing to engage with this community, and really think about how do we continue to make this data accessible to the public in a meaningful way, but also to those other end users and the like. And so certainly a conversation we'd like to continue. I do want to flag a couple of things as we close out. If you are not part of the California Water Data Consortium's listserv, please do subscribe. It's where you'll receive updates on the presentations and recordings when they become available. And so Amanda is going to drop that link into chat. You'll also receive information there on our future Data for Lunch series, as well as other news items, relevant news items. We're currently working on one in June with the climate registry, so look for that. And then finally, we're always looking for suggestions for other Data for Lunch topics. And so please reach out to either me or other staff members if you have suggestions or other topics that you think would be that this group would enjoy hearing about. So with that, I'm going to sort of close out the formal portion of our discussion, and then we'll transition to a sort of less formal way. Would encourage you guys to come off mute if you desire to ask your questions in person. I see Patrick's got his hand raised, so that's great. And then we'll also work our way through some of the questions that we didn't get through to this point in time. So thank you all for being here. And thank you again, John and Jeremiah, but don't leave.
Thanks for having us.
I appreciate it. Okay, and Patrick.
Patrick, you're
Oh,
muted.
you're muted.
We can't hear you.
Okay, I think I gave you the ability to unmute. Now try again.
Thank you. Thank you for that, and thank you for the great presentation. I remember about a decade ago, there was the new California Water Atlas, which recapitulated the kind of original water atlas in the first iteration of Jerry Brown. How do you guys think about, the longevity of these types of initiatives? That effort kind of is a similar sort of thing, like big picture, where are we at as a state? How do we think to make sure that these things kind of live on or are creative? Seems like this is something that we should be able to solve with like open source and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I have a thought on that, and maybe John has some more to add. I'm highly skeptical of completely automated solutions because I find that humans are the key ingredient for making this kind of stuff work and making sure it works continuously. As John said, we built this almost 2 years ago, and he checks it at least once a month and goes through it and make sure that things are still accurate and the data is still flowing as it should. So, the log roll is fund your local journalists, and maybe they'll be able to help do this this kind of work. But the short answer, the more unsatisfactory answer is probably some sort of collaboration. I would be very excited to see this kind of thing come from the state. However, I don't think the state has the same explanatory power that journalists do, just because it's not focused in that way. And so I really like that our effort comes from a newsroom. I think that helps with the longevity. And I can't promise, but I'm pretty sure as long as John is the data editor at CalMatters, this water dashboard will exist. So.
Awesome, thank you. I see Stu has his hand raised. Go ahead, Stu.
Hi, well, as a former journalist and a former state data person, I'm really excited to see you using this data. Are you seeing others use the data that you post on the website in new ways that it cycles through? And is there any thought? I mean, the whole world of open data has been one of promise and frustration. And I'm just wondering if you see your role as an intermediary for making that data more easy to use or reaching a broader audience than the government folks can do. Yeah,
we eventually want to publicize the endpoints that we use for our dashboard, so other people could, if they're building, maybe they just need they want to make a chart of dry well reports. Being able to tap into that endpoint, being able to convert that JSON file into a CSV. So yeah, we haven't nearly made that data available enough as much as we'd like to, but that we do plan to do that.
Yeah, great. And I'll add that we usually see stuff working the other way, actually. So frequently our water reporter will say, hey, there's this new issue. I want to write a story about it. What data exists? John and I go, we look through the data, we say, hey, let's make a map for this story. Oh, but this data updates every week. Like, can we add this to the dashboard? And so frequently that's our collaboration model right now, but it would be great to get a little more external collaboration too.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And we had a question from Chris Bond on where you specifically, where the DWR data that you're using is located. Curious if you guys have links to that. Again, with this idea, I guess, that you'll make some of those endpoints available down the road.
Yeah, give me a second and I can just drop some links in the chat.
Excellent.
there.
Okay.
Well, we have a vast preference for stuff that's on data.ca.gov. I'll just say that, like, because, you know, then
That's nice to hear.
not because we're necessarily buying into the open data effort, although John and I both came from the open data community before we were journalists, but because it has stable URLs, it encourages machine readable formats, and frequently it has a useful timestamp and contact.
Awesome. Great. And we'll follow up. I don't know if Chris needed to drop off, but we can certainly follow up with him and provide him those links, John, if you're able to drop them in and connect him with you if he wants to do so. He also had some suggestions about some of the next steps, specifically around, for example, where groundwater recharge projects are located, how much water they're recharging and extracting annually. And I'm sure you're thinking about some of that as you think about sort of the functionality of Sigma moving forward. But that was one of the suggestions provided, and along with several others. One was on the use of potable versus recycled water. And we had a few other suggestions. Rafa asked a question about water transfers and water markets and whether you've worked with those data previously.
Yeah, thanks for posting that. I hadn't yet, but now that you sent the link, I certainly will spend part of the afternoon doing exactly that.
Well, I'm glad it works. That data, by the way, is not updated every day, but I can update it manually.
Okay, yeah, you know, we like data that's updated every day, but it's more important that it's updated more than once a year, let's say,
Yeah.
for our perspective.
We collect it once a year, so.
Okay, well, we'll take what we can get.
Yeah, and there was sort of a +1 to that from Chris about visualizing water transfer data, particularly from California sellers in from Northern California south and the like. So I think a few different ideas there.
Yeah, I think the water quote unquote markets are quite opaque in terms of comprehension among people. I haven't looked at this data, so I can't say they're opaque like truly. But it's something we've thought about and tried to explore a little bit more. We haven't yet tackled that in earnest, but it's something we should probably look at.
With the I just dropped some of the links in chat, but just a caveat is, you know, there's like an ArcGIS map in there, for example. So we would have to go in there and extract the data as a query there. So for you, you know, when you look at it, it's just a map, but we're actually like extracting that underlying data. Also, I think with the what's it? Oh yeah, table A. Yeah, we do that manually, but like that, what I linked to is it's just their historic, like a PDF, the historic allocations.
Awesome.
So thank you, Jamie.
Great. We're getting some other links. We can add those too. We can add these as resources to the landing page for the site, and potentially even continue to build that out if that's helpful. We had a question from Dave Orth, who asked, are there any plans to source federal Central Valley Project data on the site?
Sort of. My understanding is that the federal project is mostly agricultural, and so you know, missing the agricultural. The dashboard has a big gaping hole, which is farms. You know, there's very little on the dashboard at all about farms, and so that's something that we've wanted to tackle for a while. But you know, when you add some data, for instance, we have been collecting some ecological data, the smelt and the salmon data since we launched dashboard, but it's not on there because we have a policy or a philosophy, at least, of presenting many pieces of a story. So we can't just put one data point up there about a complicated topic, because that's not the end of the story for that particular thing. So we're interested in sourcing data from the feds. I got to say that I think DWR is better at making data we can use than the feds. Fed data, in my experience, tends to be really, really big because it's national, and it tends to be obscure geospatial formats. So shall we say sometimes best case is a shapefile, but sometimes you get these crazy other files that you have to kind of work through. So we haven't dug into it too much. But I'd be curious to connect and hear like what you think would be valuable to put up in terms of the federal water data.
Right. And I know Dave had to drop off, but happy to connect you with him as well. This is a topic that's come up for us recently. So another area we'll do some follow-up after this. We have a question from Eamon with EKI who says, can you talk about the tools script? Oh, you responded to this one. Okay.
I think there's a question that Patrick had in that thread though, which is I don't know if Patrick dropped out, but why not make, you know, we use open data, why not make our code open too? You know, philosophically 100% agree. In terms of a 3-person team servicing 30 other reporters and just the priority of stuff, it's just not a high priority. And I understand why it should be the case that we release it. But getting your code in a place, especially as a journalist, where you can share it is very time intensive, because every calculation we go through, we have to make sure, you know, we already made sure it's right, but we have to make sure it's documented and it's clear so that people can trace the provenance of the data all the way through. And so in general, what we tend to do to have it both ways, so to speak, is we publish clean data. And we don't do that on water yet, but we do that, for instance, on some financial disclosure information in the legislature and some other data sets. We clean them up, and we have a very decisive effort to say this is public data, but we don't make a lot of our code public. Mostly because we don't have enough people, I think, right, John? I don't know if you have another answer for why we don't do that a lot.
I was just about to answer. Yeah, it's primarily documentation. Just it takes so much time to document and like really get code to a state where it's like open source worthy and available for consumption. You know, yeah, it's not that we don't want to do it. It's just, you know, it's like, do I have time to like work on a project like that? Probably not, because there's like breaking news, you know, or other like massive projects going on. But we do try to be as, you know, we try to be as open source as we can, like provided the time we have. So
Fair enough. And I see James has a question here. James, did you want to ask that question, or would you prefer that I ask it?
Sure, I can ask it. I was just trying to pile on to the previous statement, but yeah, a few years ago when I was doing some master's program work in GIS, one of the issues with trying to share code was that the libraries and tools were changing pretty frequently and quickly on the geospatial front. I'm just curious whether things have stabilized more now and you're able to sort of keep the same tools and libraries in use for, you know, multiple years, or if you're going through these cycles of having to change tools or go to the next best thing more quickly than that.
So I'll just caveat this with saying that we mostly write in JavaScript. Most of our tools are written in JavaScript, so we use JavaScript tools. That's not to disparage other programming communities. It's just the one that we use and find most comfortable. And I would say that I don't know, James, what time period were you talking about? Like 2010 through 2017 kind of churn, or before that?
Yeah, like pre-2015, yeah.
Yeah. And when I think back on that period, a lot of the churn was tools getting created, because there weren't a lot of tools before that. You know, there was Esri and some other stuff, but we kind of went through a Cambrian explosion of sorts, and it is cooled a little bit. And so what I would say right now is the most rapidly changing spot in the web mapping technology, and we don't do a lot of cutting edge web mapping stuff. So the kind of tools we use, geospatial analysis tools, are pretty stable. And so I can just tell you the names of those, but again, they're all in JavaScript, or frequently in JavaScript. We do sometimes write pipelines that merge a couple different languages together if there's a tool we really need, but For very frequently, we use a tool called Map Shaper for
Mhm.
converting between various geospatial formats. And then we use a library. I mean, I cannot speak highly enough of a library called Turf.js, which enables us to do some what were once very complicated geospatial analysis relatively easily, such that we actually frequently do it in interactive. So if you go on our website and read our stories, not on water, but on other things, we'll frequently have interactive, like, hey, put in your address and we'll tell you what weird form of the bureaucracy you live in. And the way we do that is through point and polygon searches. And we can do that very quickly and very efficiently on a per request basis because of the library like Turf.js.
Interesting. Thank you.
Other questions? Thanks, James. So John and Jeremiah, you have indicated that you're continuing to build out the dashboard or the tracker, and clearly there's interest from this community. What's the best way for this group to become involved in your work or provide feedback or the like?
Definitely email us.
Yeah.
And be as candid and ruthless as you feel like you need to be, especially with feedback. I mean, we want that. We want to make sure that the product that we have, is the best it could be. And we're journalists, we have thick skins when it comes to that. So, but yeah, feel free to email us, Jeremiah@CalMatters.org, John@CalMatters.org. If we don't respond right away, it's not because we don't want to talk. It might be because we're on deadline or something like that. But that's probably the best place.
Yeah, and we love things you think are missing, things you think could be clearer. In polite conversation, when you tell someone that they're wrong, it's a little aggressive. But when you're talking to a journalist, it's imperative that you say things like that because, if you send me an email, it's like, this is wrong. Then even if I'm on a deadline, I'm going to say, hey, John, we might have made a mistake. We should probably look at it. So, accuracy is something we put above everything else. So please, please, please let us know if you see something that's a mistake. But other than that, we'd love to hear about new data that's coming out. We'd love to hear new data that you think adds a dimension to a particular policy area. We would love to hear how you, as a person involved with this data, think about measuring various things like agricultural water usage or Sigma compliance or whatever it might be. We would love to hear any sort of weird, nuanced metrics that are informal among you and your peers for your particular data. Because again, we're always trying to increase comprehension of the general populace. And I probably don't have to tell this group, but not many people know very much about water besides that they drink it, they need it, and sometimes they have to stop watering their lawn.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I know I had one other question, which is, I know we talked about previously that right now you're focused more on drought, but that you have considered expanding it out to talk a little bit more about flooding and other things. Is that still something that you're thinking about? And what are there ways that this group can engage in that work, or that you'd like feedback or the like?
Any resources you could suggest that would help us track flood risk, anything that's like as close to real time about like soil moisture or flooding or sorry, accumulation, like anything like that, anything that would help us kind of follow, particularly when the storms happen. We were actually thinking about doing like a storm mode for the dashboard, like when there is going to be like a really bad, like, bout of rain, and like thinking about like what can we tell our readers that's going to be important and potentially life-saving for them. So like, yeah, I mean, anything that could just help us, risk and real-time stuff, historical, anything like that. And also like levies. Like I know there's a lot. I know there's a lot of private levies and as well as public levies, but like just good data sets on that. But anything that could help us better track flood risk.
Okay.
Yeah, and to underscore, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Historical maps are super valuable for us, especially if they've already been digitized. When John and I were building this, We probably spent 2 weeks just blackjawed at the 1861 flood in the Sacramento Valley. Just like, what? Are you kidding me? And so I know there's not satellite imagery of that time period, but for instance, we did a story on the reemergence of the Tulare Lake a couple months ago, and finding the shapefile for the perimeter of the historic lake bed was a deal. It took hours. And so if you have any sort of historical mapping, that's all useful to us. I'm gonna drop a link here in the chat. This is like a NOAA chart, but to underscore something John said, like as far as we can tell, this is among the more detailed soil moisture data that we can find, and it's locked away in a PNG. Now we can do georeferencing and stuff like that, and we have done that, but again, that's pretty time intensive. So any sort of machine readable granular data on soil moisture or soil moisture anomalies, because again we try and always have like that historical context, are super valuable for us. And then anything that shows like where the government can't go, so like the private levies, super interesting because the data is probably less high quality, it's probably outdated, and it's probably got massive holes in it. And so it's always hard to visualize the holes, but when you do it, it's super meaningful because it makes it very clear where things are missing.
Awesome. That's great. Well, hopefully you have some people who can reach out and help source some of that data for you. Any other questions before we sign off?
No, but thank you, Tara, for putting this together, and to the team over there, and for really interesting conversation with two committed journalists.
Yeah, no kidding. Really appreciate it, both of you. And thanks for the time. And I feel like we've got lots of follow-up that we'll do with some of the individuals here. And I suspect you'll get pinged by several individuals as well. So thank you both for sharing your time and all the work that you've been doing on this.
Thanks for inviting us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Right. Take care.
Thank you.